A Slow World's Bedtime Story. Part 1. The Canyon at Dusk. The heat began to loosen its grip around 6 in the evening. Tomás could feel it, the subtle shift in the air, the first breath of something cooler moving down through the canyon. He lay on his narrow bed in the stone dwelling, eyes open, watching the quality of light change on the carved ceiling above him. From burning white to amber, from amber to gold. The stone walls, which had spent all day radiating the warmth they'd absorbed, began to cool against his palm when he pressed his hand to them. Soon. He had lived in this canyon for 7 years now, and his body had learned its rhythms the way a musician learns an instrument. He no longer needed clocks. The angle of light on the canyon wall told him the hour. The temperature of the stone told him the season. The sounds, or the absence of them, told him everything else. During the day, the canyon was silent, too hot for anything to move, too bright for anything to sing. The plants closed their pores and waited. The creatures burrowed deep and slept. Even the spring which fed the Oasis pool seemed to flow more quietly in the heat, as if the water itself was conserving energy. But at dusk, everything changed. Tomás rose from his bed and moved through the cool darkness of the dwelling. 3 rooms carved into the canyon wall by hands that had been dust for 1,000 years. The people who made this place had understood the desert, had known that survival meant surrendering to its rhythms rather than fighting them. They had lived by night and slept by day. They had built their homes in the rock where the sun could not reach. They had tended gardens that bloomed in the darkness. Tomás was the latest in a long line of keepers. He would not be the last. He washed his face in the stone basin, the water cool from the cistern that collected the spring's overflow. He dressed in light cotton, loose trousers, a worn shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. He ate a simple meal: flatbread, olives, a handful of dried apricots, tea that he brewed over a small spirit lamp. He ate slowly, watching the light continue to change through the narrow window that faced west. Gold to copper, copper to rose. When the first stars appeared above the canyon rim, he stood, gathered his tools, and walked out into the garden. Part 2. The Stone Dwelling. The dwelling had been waiting for him when he arrived 7 years ago. He had come to the canyon in grief, his wife Elena gone 6 months, the university position that had defined his life suddenly meaningless, the apartment they had shared unbearable in its emptiness. A colleague had mentioned this place, an old research station, abandoned for decades, in need of someone to maintain the botanical collection. The pay was negligible. The isolation was absolute. The work was endless. It had sounded like exactly what he needed. The journey in had taken 3 days. A truck to the nearest village, then a mule track into the mountains, then a footpath down into the canyon that required ropes in 2 places. The supply runner, a weathered woman named Sina who made the trip 4 times a year, had led him down and left him at the canyon floor with 6 months of provisions and a warning. The desert doesn't care about your sadness. Tend the garden or don't. It will outlast you either way. He had stood alone in the canyon, his pack at his feet, and looked at what would become his home. The stone dwellings were smaller than he had expected, tucked into an alcove in the canyon wall where an overhang provided shade. The gardens spread below them, terraced into the canyon floor, fed by a spring that emerged from a crack in the rock and filled a series of pools before disappearing into the sand at the canyon's far end. The plants were overgrown but alive: night-blooming cereus, sacred datura, desert lavender, agave, and dozens of species he didn't recognize at first glance. It was beautiful. It was neglected. It needed him. That first night, he had sat outside the dwelling until dawn, watching the garden come alive in the darkness. Moths he had never seen before. Bats so small they seemed impossible. Flowers opening like slow explosions, releasing perfume into the cooling air. Elena would have loved this, he had thought. And then, Elena is why I'm here. He had begun work the next evening and he had not stopped since. Part 3. First light of the lantern. The lantern was old, brass and glass, the flame fed by oil he rendered from the fat of desert plants. It cast a warm amber glow that seemed to belong to the night rather than intrude upon it. Electric light would have been harsher, more efficient, wrong. This light moved with him like a companion, pooling around his feet, catching the edges of leaves and petals, leaving soft shadows in its wake. Tomás walked the main path first, as he did every evening, surveying the garden's condition. The path was laid with flat stones, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, winding between raised beds and around the edges of the pools. In daylight, the garden looked brown and dormant, the plants conserving their energy, their leaves folded or curled, their flowers tightly closed. But now, in the lantern light, he could see the first stirrings of the night's transformation. The sacred datura was already beginning to open. He paused beside the plant, a sprawling bush with dark green leaves and trumpet-shaped flowers the color of moonlight. The blooms had been closed all day, furled tight against the heat. But now, they were unfurling, slowly, incrementally, their white petals spreading like the fingers of an opening hand. By full dark, they would be completely open, releasing their heavy, intoxicating scent into the air. Tomás had learned to read the garden's moods by which flowers opened first. Datura meant a warm night, good for the heat-loving species. When the evening primrose led instead, cooler air was coming. When the cereus stirred before anything else, rain was approaching, sometimes still days away. But the plants knew. Tonight, the datura was first. A warm night then. Good for the moths. He continued his circuit, checking the irrigation channels, noting which plants needed attention, which were thriving, which were struggling. The garden held over 200 species now, some native to this desert, some brought from similar climates around the world, all adapted to the rhythm of blooming in darkness and sleeping through the brutal days. His predecessor had started the collection. Her predecessor had started it before her. The garden was older than any of them, older than the dwelling, perhaps as old as the spring itself. Generation after generation of keepers had added to it, protected it, passed it on. Tomás added too. Last year, a night-blooming jasmine from the coastal deserts to the south. The year before, a rare moonflower that had been thought extinct until a botanist found a single specimen in a remote canyon 300 miles away. The garden grew, slowly, carefully, one plant at a time. He finished his circuit and returned to the tool shed, a smaller stone structure near the dwelling, to gather what he would need for the night's work. Pruning shears, a small trowel. The watering can, which he filled from the nearest pool. A soft brush for hand pollination. A notebook and pencil for observations. Then he went to work. Part 4. The moths arrive. They came with the full darkness when the last glow of sunset had faded from the canyon rim and the stars had emerged in their thousands. Tomás heard them before he saw them, a soft thrumming, almost below the threshold of hearing, like a vibration in the air itself. He looked up from the agave he was tending and watched them descend into the garden, the sphinx moths, their wings catching the lantern light as they spiraled down from wherever they spent the daylight hours. There were perhaps a dozen of them tonight, Large moths, the largest he had ever encountered, wingspans as wide as his spread hand, their bodies thick and furred, their wings patterned in amber and rose and deep burgundy. When the lantern light passed through those wings, they glowed like stained glass, like windows in a cathedral he had visited once with Elena, long ago in a country far from here. The moths moved to the datura first, as they always did. They hovered before the open trumpets, their wings beating so fast they blurred, their long proboscises uncurling to reach the nectar deep within the flowers. They made no sound except that low thrumming, that vibration that Tomás felt in his chest, more than heard with his ears. He had named them over the years. He knew he shouldn't, knew that scientists were supposed to maintain objectivity, supposed to see specimens rather than individuals. But he had been alone too long for that kind of discipline. Clara was the largest, her wings more amber than the others, a distinctive notch in her left forewing, where something had once tried to catch her and failed. She was bold, often feeding from flowers mere inches from where Tomás was working, apparently unbothered by his presence. Vespera was smaller, her colouring darker, almost entirely burgundy with just a few amber accents. She was more cautious than Clara, keeping her distance, but she had been coming to the garden for at least 5 years now, long-lived for a moth, suggesting that something about this place sustained her. The old gentleman was the largest male, his wings faded with age, his movements slower than the others. Tomás had watched him decline over the past 2 seasons, his visits growing less frequent, his feeding times growing shorter. He would not survive another year, probably, but he was here tonight, hovering at a datura bloom, and Tomás was glad to see him. He watched them feed for a long while, his work momentarily forgotten. This was why he had come here, in the end. Not just to tend the garden, but to witness it. To be present for the small miracles that happened every night, unseen by almost everyone, continuing whether or not anyone was there to watch. The moths asked nothing of him. They did not know his name or his history or his grief. They simply lived, fed, pollinated, continued. And somehow, watching them, he found that he could continue too. Part 5. The pools. The spring emerged from a crack in the canyon wall about 20 meters above the garden, trickling down a natural channel in the rock before collecting in the first of 3 pools. From there, the water flowed through a series of channels, some natural, some carved by ancient hands, irrigating the terraced beds before gathering in the lowest pool and eventually seeping into the sand at the canyon's end. Water in the desert was sacred. Tomás treated it accordingly. He made his way to the upper pool, lantern in one hand, watering can in the other. The pool was small, perhaps 3 meters across, and shallow, its bottom covered in fine sand that filtered the water as it emerged from the rock. The surface was still, reflecting the stars, and as Tomás approached, small ripples spread from the edges where nocturnal creatures had come to drink. He filled his watering can and carried it to the nearest bed, a collection of night-blooming cacti that required careful, infrequent irrigation. Too much water, and they would rot. Too little, and they would not flower. He had learned the balance over years of observation, of failure, of trying again. The sound of water leaving the can was the sound of the garden breathing. Each plant received what it needed, no more, no less. The overflow returned to the channels, rejoined the flow, continued its journey toward the sand. Tomás moved from bed to bed, watering can emptying and refilling, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no rush. The night was long, and the work would fill it exactly, leaving no time empty, no hour unfilled. At the middle pool, he paused to rest. This pool was larger than the upper one, deeper, its water darker. During the day, it was too hot to approach, the water warm enough to scald, the rocks around it radiating heat like a furnace. But at night, it cooled and the creatures came. Tomás sat on a flat stone at the pool's edge and watched. A canyon mouse appeared first, small and brown, its ears enormous, its whiskers twitching. It approached the water's edge with the caution of prey, checking for danger before lowering its head to drink. Tomás remained still, and the mouse ignored him, finishing its drink and vanishing into the rocks. Then another mouse, and another, a small lizard that Tomás rarely saw, its scales catching the starlight. Something larger moving in the shadows at the far end of the pool, a ringtail perhaps, one of the cat-like creatures that hunted in the canyon at night. It did not approach while he was there, but he glimpsed its eyes reflecting the lantern light before it retreated. The desert was full of life. You simply had to be quiet enough, patient enough, present enough to see it. Part 6. Midnight Visitors. The bats arrived around midnight. Tomás was hand-pollinating a cluster of rare moonflowers when he heard them, high-pitched chittering, almost beyond the range of his aging ears coming from somewhere above. He looked up and saw them descending in a loose group, 5 or 6 tiny shapes flickering against the stars. The nectar bats were the smallest he had ever encountered. Their bodies were no larger than walnuts, their wings translucent membranes stretched over delicate bones, their faces oddly endearing. Large eyes, small snouts, ears that seemed too big for their heads. They fed on nectar and pollen, visiting flowers that were too small or too delicate for the larger moths, filling an ecological niche that would otherwise go empty. They were also, Tomás had discovered, remarkably unafraid. The first few years they had kept their distance, treating him as they treated any large animal, a potential threat to be avoided. But over time, as he moved through the garden night after night, never harming them, never chasing them, never doing anything but tending the plants they depended on, they had relaxed. Now they fed within arm's reach of him, chittering to each other as they moved from flower to flower. One of them, a female he recognized by a distinctive white patch on her chest, had landed on his hand once, 2 seasons ago. She had rested there for perhaps 5 seconds, her tiny claws gripping his finger, her wings folded, her dark eyes studying him with what might have been curiosity. Then she had lifted off and resumed feeding, and he had stood frozen in wonder for a long time afterward. She was here tonight. He saw the white patch as she passed through the lantern light, hovering at a cluster of small yellow flowers that grew along the irrigation channel. He held out his hand, not expecting anything, simply offering. She did not land, but she flew close, circling his fingers once before moving on, and he chose to interpret that as recognition. The amber beetles began their nightly procession as the bats fed. They emerged from somewhere in the rocks, he had never found exactly where, and made their way along the stone paths in single file, their bioluminescent abdomens glowing with a warm amber light. They looked like a line of tiny lanterns, like a procession of monks carrying candles, like something from a story he might have read as a child. Tomás had studied them in his first year, trying to understand the mechanism of their glow, the purpose it served. He had concluded that it was a mating display. The brighter the glow, the more attractive the beetle to potential partners. But knowing the science did not diminish the magic. If anything, it deepened it. Evolution had produced this. Beetles that carried their own light through the desert darkness, beautiful without purpose beyond the continuation of their kind. He stepped carefully around them as he worked, never disturbing their procession. And above it all, on the dead branch of an old juniper that overlooked the garden, the owl watched. Part 7. The Owl. She had been here before him. Tomás had realized this in his first week when he noticed the pellets beneath the juniper, the scratch marks on the bark, the particular stillness of the branch where she perched. The owl had claimed this territory long before he arrived, and she had graciously, or perhaps indifferently, allowed him to share it. She was small for an owl, a species adapted to the desert, mottled grey and brown, with ear tufts that stood up like small horns, and enormous yellow eyes that reflected the lantern light when she turned her head to watch him. She hunted the canyon mice and the small lizards, dropping silently from her perch, striking, returning with her prey to eat in private. Tomás had named her Minerva, after the Roman goddess of wisdom, though he knew she was simply an owl doing what owls did, surviving in the way her kind had survived for millions of years. The name was for him, not for her. They had an understanding, he and Minerva. He did not approach the juniper where she perched. She did not flee when he worked nearby. They occupied the same space, attended to their separate tasks, and occasionally, when he paused in his work and looked up, or when she paused in her watching and looked down, their eyes met across the garden. He did not know what she saw when she looked at him. A large, slow-moving creature, probably. A source of disturbance that had proven harmless over time. Perhaps nothing more than a feature of the landscape, no more significant than the rocks or the pools or the plants. But when he looked at her, he saw something like companionship, something like witness. Another consciousness sharing the night with him, aware of his presence as he was aware of hers. It was enough. It was more than he had expected when he came to this canyon, more than he had thought he deserved. Tonight, Minerva was particularly active. She dropped from her perch 3 times in the first hour, each time returning with a mouse or a lizard, each time settling back on her branch to eat. Tomás watched her from the corner of his eye, careful not to stare. Prey animals stared, and he did not want her to mistake him for prey or predator. On her 4th descent, she did something unusual. Instead of returning to the juniper, she landed on a low rock near where Tomás was working, her prey, a mouse, already dead, dangling from her talons. She stood there for a long moment watching him, her head tilting in that distinctive owl way. Then she flew to the juniper, leaving the mouse on the rock. Tomás stared at the small body, his heart suddenly beating fast. Was it an offering? A mistake? A territorial display of some kind? He did not know. He could not know. Owl behavior was not his specialty, and even the specialists would probably have struggled to explain this. He left the mouse where it was. In the morning, it would be gone, taken by something else, or by Minerva herself if she changed her mind. But for the rest of the night, he worked with a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. He was not alone here. He had never been alone. Part 8. A rare bloom. In his 3rd year, Tomás had planted a queen of the night. The cutting had come from a botanical garden far to the east, wrapped in damp cloth and packed in a cooler that Sina had carried down the canyon with evident annoyance. "This had better be worth it," she had said, handing it over. "That thing weighed more than the rest of your supplies combined." It had been worth it. The queen of the night, Selenicerius grandiflorus, night-blooming cereus, princess of the night, depending on who was naming it, was one of the rarest and most spectacular flowers in the world. It bloomed only once a year, only at night, and only for a few hours. By dawn, the flower would be wilted, spent, gone. Those who wanted to see it had to be present at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place. Tomás had been waiting for 4 years, The plant had grown slowly, establishing its roots, putting out the flat, cactus-like stems that looked so unremarkable in daylight. Each spring, he had checked for the swelling that would indicate a coming bloom. Each spring, he had been disappointed, until tonight. He had noticed it 3 days ago, a small bump on one of the stems, slightly different in color and texture from the rest. He had watched it grow, swelling larger each day, and he had calculated that tonight, if his observations were correct, the flower would finally open. He saved it for last. All through the evening, he worked on other tasks, watering, pruning, pollinating, observing, while the anticipation built in his chest. The moths came and went. The bats chittered and fed. Minerva made her rounds, and the queen of the night waited, her buds swelling larger in the darkness, preparing for her single moment of glory. Around 2 in the morning, Tomás set down his tools and walked to the far corner of the garden where the cereus grew. The bud was enormous now, the size of his fist, its outer petals beginning to separate, a glimpse of white visible between them. He sat down on the ground nearby, lantern beside him, and watched. It happened slowly. Then, all at once, the outer petals peeled back first, revealing layer after layer of inner petals, each one whiter than the last. The flower expanded, unfolding, spreading, until it was as wide as a dinner plate, pure white in the center, surrounded by a spray of delicate filaments, crowned with a cluster of golden stamens that caught the lantern light like tiny suns. The fragrance hit him a moment later, sweet, heavy, intoxicating, the scent of vanilla and jasmine and something else, something that had no name, something that existed only here, only now, only for these few hours. Tomás sat in the presence of the flower and wept. He wept for Elena, who would never see this. He wept for the years they had lost, the years they had had, the years that stretched ahead of him without her. He wept for the beauty of the flower and the brevity of its blooming, and the fact that he was here, alive, to witness it when so much else had ended. The moths found the flower within minutes. Clara arrived first, hovering at its edge, her proboscis uncoiling to reach the nectar within. Then Vespera and the old gentleman and others Tomás did not recognize, drawn from across the canyon by the fragrance, gathering to feed on something that would not exist by morning. He watched until his eyes grew heavy and his tears dried on his cheeks. Then he returned to work. The garden needed him. The night was not yet over. Part 9, The Supply Runner. Sina came 4 times a year. She arrived at the canyon rim in late morning when the heat was already building and made her way down the rope-assisted paths with the ease of someone who had been doing this for decades. She was perhaps 60, perhaps older, her face weathered by sun and wind, her body lean and strong, her manner direct to the point of bluntness. She brought supplies, dried food, oil for his lantern, seeds he had requested, letters from colleagues in the outside world. She took away his journals, his seed collections, his own letters responding to the ones he had received. The exchange took perhaps 2 hours, most of it spent in the shade of the dwelling while the canyon baked around them. "You look thinner," she said, "this visit. Eating enough?" "Enough," Tomás said. "I eat enough." She did not sound convinced. The garden? Thriving. The queen of the night finally bloomed. Her eyebrows rose. After 4 years? After 4 years. Worth the wait? He thought of the flower, white in the darkness, the moths gathering, the scent that had stayed with him for days. Yes, he said, it was worth the wait. Sina nodded, asking no further questions. She understood, in her way. She had been making this run for 15 years, had known his predecessor and his predecessor's predecessor, had seen keepers come and go. She did not pry into their reasons for being here, didn't ask about the lives they had left behind. She simply brought supplies, took away journals, and left them to their solitude. News from outside? Tomás asked, as he always did. The usual: wars, elections, someone discovered a new comet. They're naming it after a dead astronomer I never heard of. Anything that affects us? Does anything ever? He smiled. It was their ritual, this exchange. The world outside continued its dramas, and the canyon remained unchanged, and neither of them pretended that it was otherwise. "Will you stay the night?" he asked. She shook her head. "Need to make the village by tomorrow. Got another run after this, farther south." "Be safe then." "Always am." She stood, brushing dust from her trousers. "See you in 3 months. Try to eat more." He walked her to the base of the cliff path and watched her climb until she disappeared over the rim. Then he returned to the dwelling, lay down on his bed and slept through the heat of the day. When he woke at dusk, the loneliness that had settled in his chest during Sina's visit had faded. The garden was waiting. The moths were coming. The night stretched ahead of him, full of work to be done. He lit his lantern and walked outside. Part 10. Before dawn. The darkest hour came around 4 in the morning. By then, the first wave of nocturnal activity had passed. The moths had fed and dispersed, seeking shelter before the coming heat. The bats had returned to whatever crevice they called home. Even Minerva had gone quiet, digesting her night's hunting in drowsy stillness on her perch. This was Tomás's favorite time. The garden was silent except for the trickle of water from the spring, the occasional rustle of a mouse in the undergrowth, the distant call of a nightjar somewhere up on the canyon rim. The air was cool, genuinely cool, the first chill before dawn, and the flowers that had been open all night were beginning, slowly, to close. He walked the paths one final time, lantern low, checking that everything was as it should be. The irrigation channels were flowing, the beds were watered, the pruning was done. Tonight rather, after he slept through the day, there would be more work. There was always more work. But for now, in this suspended moment between night and day, the garden was at peace. He paused at the upper pool, looking down at the water. His reflection looked back at him, a man in his 60s, grey-haired, weathered, thinner than he should be. Eleanor would have fussed over him, would have insisted on more meals, more rest, more attention to his own well-being. But Eleanor was gone, and he had only himself to answer to. And the truth was that he did not mind the thinness, the weathering, the visible signs of age. He was becoming part of the canyon, slowly, the way the stones became part of the canyon, the way the water became part of the canyon. It was not a bad fate. "Good night," he said softly, to the garden, to the creatures, to the memory of his wife. "Thank you." The garden did not answer. It did not need to. Its answer was in its existence, in its continuation, in the fact that it would be here tomorrow night and the night after that, waiting for him, needing him, giving him purpose. He extinguished his lantern and made his way back to the dwelling by starlight. Part 11. The heat returns. By 7 in the morning, the canyon was an oven. The sun had not yet cleared the eastern rim, but its light was pouring into the sky, turning the stone walls from grey to gold to blinding white. The temperature climbed rapidly, from merely warm at 6 to hot at 7 to unbearable by 8. The plants closed their pores. The creatures vanished into shade. The spring itself seemed to quiet, its trickle reduced, its pools steaming faintly in the early light. Tomás retreated to the stone dwelling and sealed the door behind him. Inside, it was cool. The thick walls, which had spent all night radiating away the previous day's heat, now served as insulation against the new day's assault. The small windows were shuttered. The air was still and dark and blessedly comfortable. He ate a small breakfast, more flatbread, some dried fruit, the last of the tea, and then he lay down on his bed and closed his eyes. Sleep came easily, as it always did after a night of work. His body knew this rhythm now, knew that the day was for rest and the night was for action, knew that the hours of darkness were when he truly lived. The dreams that came were gentle ones. Elena's face, the smell of night-blooming jasmine, the sound of water trickling over stone. He slept through the worst of the heat. When he woke, the light coming through the shutters had shifted from white to amber, and the temperature inside the dwelling had begun to rise. A signal that outside, the day was beginning to release its grip. He lay still for a while longer, listening to the silence, feeling the rhythm of the canyon in his bones. Soon the night would come again. The flowers would open. The moths would arrive. Minerva would take her place on the juniper branch, and the bats would chitter in the darkness, and the beetles would process along the paths like tiny pilgrims. And he would be there to witness it, as he had been for 7 years, as he would be for as many years as he had left. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Part 12, 7 years to 200 hence. From the journal of Tomás Reyes, found in the stone dwelling after his death at the age of 74. I have been trying to write this entry for 3 days now. The words do not come easily. They never have, not for the things that matter most. Elena used to tease me about this. The botanist who could write 10 pages about the reproductive cycle of a cactus, but could not find 3 sentences to describe how he felt about his wife. "You love me," she would say, laughing. "I know you do. But you'll never manage to say it properly, will you?" She was right, of course. She was always right. I am trying now, Elena. For you, and for whoever finds this journal when I am gone. I came to this canyon because I could not bear to be anywhere else. The apartment we shared was full of your absence. The university was full of people who looked at me with pity. The world itself seemed to have shifted, become a place where you no longer existed, and I could not find my footing in it. I thought I was coming here to hide, to wait out my remaining years in solitude, doing work that no one would remember, tending a garden that no one would visit. I thought I was choosing a kind of living death, a way to exist without having to truly live. I was wrong. The garden saved me. I know how that sounds, melodramatic, sentimental, the sort of thing a grieving old man might say to justify his choices. But it is true. The garden, with its rhythms and its demands and its endless small miracles, gave me something to live for when I had convinced myself that there was nothing left. The moths saved me. Clara and Vespera and the old gentleman who finally died last spring, his wings too faded to carry him to the flowers any longer. I found his body beneath the datura, as if he had wanted to be near his favorite blooms at the end. I buried him in the garden. It seemed right. The bats saved me with their tiny bodies and their fearless hearts. The beetles, processing along the paths like a prayer. The mice, with their enormous ears and their cautious trust. Minerva, who watched over me night after night, year after year, who left a mouse on a rock once as if to say, "I see you. I know you are here." They did not know what they were doing, these creatures. They did not know that their presence was a gift, that their lives gave meaning to mine. They simply existed, as they had always existed, as they will continue to exist long after I am gone. But I know. I am writing this in what I believe will be my last season. My hands shake now, making the fine work of pollination difficult. My eyes are not what they were. The moths are blurs of colour in the darkness, their patterns impossible to distinguish. My legs ache after a full night of walking the paths, and the climb to the upper pool leaves me breathless in a way it never did before. Sena has noticed. She has offered to send someone, an assistant, a replacement, someone to take over the work I can no longer do. I have refused for now, not out of pride, though there is some of that, but because I am not yet ready to leave. Soon, I will be. Soon my body will make the decision for me, and I will have no choice but to surrender the garden to younger hands. But not tonight. Tonight, I can still lift the watering can. I can still walk the paths. I can still watch the flowers open and the moths descend and the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns. Tonight is enough. Elena, I have something to confess. I was wrong all those years ago when I said I did not know how to tell you what you meant to me. I knew. I was simply afraid of the weight of the words, afraid of what it would cost to say them aloud, afraid that once I started, I would never be able to stop. I am not afraid anymore. You were everything. You are everything. Even now, 7 years after you left, you are the voice in my head when I make a decision, the presence beside me when I walk the paths, the warmth I feel when the night is coldest and the work is hardest. And I wonder why I am still here. I am still here because you would have wanted me to be, because this garden, this work, this life, it is the kind of life you would have loved, and living it is a way of loving you, even now, even still. I will see you soon. I believe that. I have to believe it. But first, I have work to do. The sun is setting. I can see it through the window, the light on the canyon walls turning from white to gold to copper. The temperature is dropping. The first stars will appear soon, and after them, the darkness, and after that, the garden. The moths will come tonight. I can feel it. The datura is heavy with buds, and the air has that particular stillness that precedes their arrival. Clara's descendants and Vesperas, and new ones I have never seen before, drawn to the flowers as their ancestors have been drawn for 1,000,000 years. I will be there to greet them. I will walk the paths one more time, lantern in hand, watering can at my side. I will check the irrigation channels and the seedlings and the beds that need attention. I will sit by the pool and watch the creatures come to drink, and I will look up at Minerva on her perch and feel the strange peace of being known by something wild. And when dawn comes, I will return to this dwelling, and I will sleep, and I will dream of Elena, and I will wake to do it all again. This is my life. This is my purpose. This is the gift the garden has given me, and I am grateful for every moment of it. Good night, Elena. Good night, small ones. I am coming. The end. Allow silence. Allow the listener to drift. Allow sleep to come.